Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholars' virtual lecture series. And it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you will be hearing from Mark Geraghty. Mark was born in Ndola, northern Zambia in 1964, where his father was stationed as a major in the British Army. He has lived in Victoria Falls since 1995, guiding private groups in southern Africa. Now, in 2003, he married his wife, whose family had settled in Zimbabwe in 1902. This sparked an interest in Africa's early history, especially the missionaries' early travels. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Mark.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
Great.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for allowing me to come to you and tell you a little bit about how the Victoria Falls was formed. And I hope I can give you a background to all of this, and that hope you'll visit and come and see this magnificent wonder of nature that I have sitting here in Victoria Falls. Sunny, it's warm. Victoria Falls from my house is about 1.7 kilometers, the same length that the Victoria Falls is. And I can actually hear the roar of the water going over that gorge right now. Pity you can't hear it, but it is magnificent. So folks, to tell you about how the Victoria Falls was formed, we need to understand a little bit about the Zambezi River, where our own rainfall comes in, and the water levels that affect the Victoria Falls. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the discussion. The Zambezi River starts off in northern part of Zambia. I don't know if you can see right up here, and it flows a little bit into the Congo, into Angola, and then down through Zambia, coming over the Victoria Falls down here, Lake Kariba, which borders Zimbabwe and Zambia, over the Kaborabassa Dam, and then empties out into the Indian Ocean. The Zambezi River is 2,400 kilometers long, and the Victoria Falls here is halfway, about 1,400 kilometers from its source in northern Zambia. The Zambezi River is the fourth largest river in Africa, after the Congo, the Nile, and the Niger. So it's an important source of water. If you look this section here, you can see all the rivers flow north. So you do have a watershed here where all the rivers flow south into the Zambezi River. And you can see the percentages of water that actually come from the different countries feeding into the Zambezi River. Even Tanzania, way up to the north, contributes about 2% of the Zambezi's river water into it. So the river, 2,400 kilometers long, starting in northern Zambia to the Indian Ocean. To get some idea of how this all affects the Victoria Falls, we need to think about looking at the rainfalls in this region. And what you have is cold, wet air coming in the Benguela current from the South Pole, and that flows north, and it meets a warmer current coming south, the Angolan current, and it stalls that movement of water in this sort of area here. And this is now during the sort of October, November, coming into our rains. Our rains start from November through to mid-April. You get warm, dry air from the Sahara flowing south. It meets this moist air, and that's when our rains start. And the majority of the rains fall into an area here, which is the watershed of the Luapula, the Congo River, and the Zambezi River, a place called the Katanga Depression. And you do get, from November through to about January, probably about a yard of rain falls in this period. It's a vast amount of water. That fills up the Lua and the Barotse floodplains, which are the headwaters of the Zambezi River. And once that starts happening, the floods start coming down. And about January, we start seeing quite a significant rise in the water levels on the Zambezi River. And this will also be something we'll talk about a little bit later on in the talk. So once we understand where the rains come for the Zambezi River and how they affect the Victoria Falls, I'd now like to tell you about how the Victoria Falls was formed. There's some statistics on the Zambezi River that you can look at a little bit later on, if you want to have a look at those. But if you come to the Victoria Falls and you visit this part of the world, the Victoria Falls is 1.7 kilometers long from the Zimbabwe side that we call here, where David Livingstone's statue is, all the way over to the Eastern Cataract, which is the Zambian side. That's 108 meters high at its highest point, and it's slightly higher on the Zambian side at 105 meters and about 92 meters on the Zimbabwe side down here. And the highest point, just off Livingstone Island in the middle of the Victoria Falls, is about 105 meters high. Do you think that the Niagara Falls is just under, well, it's about twice the length, twice the height of the Niagara Falls, and about 500 meters longer? So you can basically put the Niagara Falls into this section here of the Victoria Falls. And this time of year now, we'll be having this magnificent waterfall now. It's the largest single curtain of falling water in the world. So folks, if you can imagine, I'm trying to give you some idea of how much water is flowing over the Zambezi River. If you come here in the lowest time, it's October, November, when the water level is at its lowest, it's around 390 to 400 cubic meters of water a second flowing over the Victoria Falls. You come this period now, mid-April onwards, when it's at its peak, it's something in the region of 4,700 cubic meters of water a minute. Now, to put that into perspective for you, New York City is a city of about 8 million people. And if you can try and imagine how much water 8 million people would use in 1 year, that flows over the Victoria Falls at its peak flood right now. The amount of water that 8 million people would use in a city flows over the Victoria Falls in 3 days. And this is fresh, clean water coming from the Barotse floodplains. There are no cities and there are no big agricultural activities going on, putting herbicides and pesticides into the water. You can literally take that water, you can boil it, and you can drink it. And again, the spray at this time of year reaches about 450 meters high, and it can be seen from 38 kilometers away. And that's basically the spray falls from the river down that 100 meters into the chasm, splashes up against this opposite rock face, and comes up as the spray from the Victoria Falls and falls down on us when we do our tour. So folks, do remember, you will get wet on this tour, particularly this time of the year. So do wear sensible walking shoes. And I normally bring an umbrella with, so you can take photographs. But when you get here, we'll tell you more about that. So to tell you a little bit how the Victoria Falls is formed, I'm going to ask you to go back in your mind's eye and try and imagine the Earth about 105 million years ago. The Victoria Falls is ancient. The Zambezi River is the oldest riverbed in the world. If you go back and you can imagine when all the continents were connected together into one big supercontinent called Gondwana or Pangaea. And if you can imagine Africa tilted on its axis about 45 degrees, and where you have Cairo now, that was sitting down by the equator. And over sort of 15, 20 million years, Africa slowly righted itself, and all the continents started breaking away from Africa. South America broke away from the west coast and drifted off to where she is now. And we know this through the fossil record. It's consistent on both sides of the Atlantic. India broke away and joined the Asian subcontinent. But what we had happen in Africa is instead of the tectonic plates drifting and breaking and the sea rushing in and separating the east coast of Africa, we had a fracture form, a Y-shaped fracture down the east coast of Africa, which is the Great East African Rift Valley. And that created things like the Great Lakes of East Africa, the mountains of Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, and the mountains of the moon. Those were all formed around the same time. And the Victoria Falls is part of that. What you had happen here about 95, 93 million years ago was an upheaval of basalt lava in this area here. Oops, excuse me. This area here, which formed a dome of basalt. And this basalt oozed out of the earth. It came out of a pipe that was at a 45-degree angle, and it layered itself. This dome of lava is about 180 kilometers in an east-west direction and 90 kilometers in a north-south direction. As this dome of lava started to cool, it fractured on the top. Much like when you bake something in the oven, you take it out of the oven, it's risen, it collapses back, and it all fractures on the top. That's pretty much the same as what happened here to this dome of basalt lava. Now, for about 20, 30 million years, not too much happened in this region. And about 7.5 million years ago, you started getting Kalahari sands being blown in from Botswana and the northern part of South Africa, the Karoo. Those sands came into this area here, and they settled on this dome of lava. And they filled up those fractures. So if we go to the next slide, I'll try to make a very simple diagram here. So you have this dome of lava with all these fractures on the top, and they widened over a period of time. The Earth was going through a very arid and dry period. The Kalahari sands come in, they fill up these cracks. And if you can see from my diagram here, the sands sit about 100 meters above the basalt bedrock. And when you come to the Victoria Falls, you look out on the valley sides, you'll see those sand ridges. If you come back again in Earth's geographical history, probably about 4.5 million years ago, the Earth was a lot wetter than it is now. And you had a paleo lake sitting on top of these sands, which was sitting on top of this hard basalt rock. And what you had happen was another upheaval of lava. So if I go back to this one, in central part of Botswana, and that lava pushed up. It created what's called the Geraghty pans, a vast dry area, really beautiful, really quiet. And what that did, it changed the course of the Zambezi River. Now, the Zambezi River at the time was flowing from northern Zambia into Angola, down through Zambia, through Botswana, and it joined the Limpopo River, which is the border between present-day South Africa and Zimbabwe. When that upheaval of lava came up, it pushed up and it turned the course of the Zambezi River. That then flowed into this lake that was sitting on top of this sand that was sitting on top of that basalt rock, if you remember this slide here. Hope I'm not going too fast for you. So the river flowed into this lake, and the volume of water was so much that you had one of these Noah Ark type of cataclysmic failures. And the Zambezi River, as we now know it, started to flow. So it flowed through Zambia, and it turned east, breaking this lake's banks, washing away all the soils that were deposited and the sands that were deposited on top of this dome of lava, flowing into the Kariba gorges and down into the Indian Ocean. And that's when the Zambezi River, as we now know it, started to flow. If you come out here on a visit, we're going to go and see the Victoria Falls. This is a shot taken by a satellite quite some time ago. You have Victoria Falls town here. You have the river coming in, and you can see these fractures that have been exposed by the river as it flowed. Now, these fractures carry on downriver for about 90 kilometers. And the Victoria Falls, as the Zambezi River has flowed, it is in an easterly direction here. It has eroded backwards, exposing all these various gorges. That may surprise you to learn that when you come to the Victoria Falls, the present day one that you see here, that is Victoria Falls number 8. There are 7 other preceding drops that have dried up as the river has eroded backwards. And when we come here, we're going to look at the formation of Victoria Falls number 9, which is down here, and that will more than likely be across this direction here in about 4,500 years' time. If we go to the next slide here, this is taken from a place called the Lookout Cafe, which is opposite the Batoka Gorge. And here you can see the different layers of basalt rock as they've come out from under the earth. Where the smooth parts are, that is a layer of basalt. And as it's cooled and all the gases have come up, it's broken up the top layer of basalt, so you had some vegetation grow. And then maybe 5,000–6,000 years later, there was another eruption, and another layer of basalt came up, and again, cooled down, creating this cake layers that you can see quite clearly from the Lookout Cafe. And we'll see that when we go there. This shot taken from quite far away can sort of show you where Victoria Falls number 8 is. There's Victoria Falls number 7. Number 6, then number 5 and number 4 going along here. That as the river has flowed in this direction, it's eroded backwards, creating and opening up all these gorges. That is something quite spectacular to see, and you can see this is the sort of view you get from a helicopter. So folks, I hope I've given you some idea of how the Victoria Falls was formed, and I'd like you to join me now. We'll go on a quick tour of the Victoria Falls, and I'll try and point out some of these features that I've spoken about. So we go to the next slide. So folks, when we start our tour, we're going to start at the entrance to the falls. We'll probably park our bus here and start at the entrance, do all the formalities to come in. And we're going to start from the Zimbabwe side. There's David Livingstone's statue, and walk across the face of the Victoria Falls here, looking out onto the actual falls itself. And you can see here we have Devil's Cataract, Cataract Island, the main falls, Livingstone Island, and then Horseshoe Falls, Rainbow Falls, Armchair Falls, and the Eastern Cataract. This is the Zambian side here, so you can't get to that because you've got the river between you, and you have to either go through customs and immigration on the Zimbabwean side and the Zambian side. The walk should take about 2–2.5 hours, depends how many photographs you take. But again, you will get wet, so please do come prepared. So folks, we'll make our way from here to David Livingstone's statue. And this is a group that I led earlier on in the year. And you can see there's a lovely sign there that says, "Welcome to Mosia Tunya." And Mosia Tunya is the Tokalea name for the Victoria Falls, which means the smoke that thunders. And I'm sure most of you know that the Victoria Falls was discovered by this gentleman here, Dr. David Livingstone, November of 1855. And I use that word discover very, very loosely. There had been people living on the banks of the Zambezi River, and they didn't need a Scotsman to come and tell them what was on their doorstep. They did know what was there. It's just they didn't travel. This is a Mokoro canoe, the kind of vessel that Livingstone would have visited the Victoria Falls in, but that's a lecture for another day, and I hope you'll join me for that. So we leave the entrance, and we now go down towards David Livingstone's statue. We'll see the statue, look out on the Devil's Cataract here, and we can start seeing the formation now of Victoria Falls number 9. So when the water levels come up, particularly this time of the year, the water flows through the island and starts eroding. And you can see this faint line, which they think may be the next Victoria Falls in 4,500 years' time. The water will fall all into this chasm behind the Victoria Falls, and all of this will dry up. It will stop flowing. So from there, we're going to move on to viewing point number 3. Before we go to viewing point number 3, which is up here on the right-hand side of your screen, David Livingstone's statue is up here on the left. We're going to pass this little part here, which gives you a nice shot down the Victoria Falls. You have the main Victoria Falls there and Livingstone Island, and a beautiful rainbow that is normally there in the afternoons on a sunny day, about 2:15 in the afternoon. You can see a very faint second rainbow there. That is a reflection of this one. So hopefully we'll come in the afternoon, we'll see that. So now we coming on to viewing point number 3 over here, looking across the gorge, and you can see the water comes flowing down, splashing up against that rock face and creating the mist. That then comes down into the Victoria Falls rainforest. And this is quite a feature of the Victoria Falls. You'll see some amazing trees in there, and it's just like a rainforest in Costa Rica or anywhere like that. We look now across from viewing point number 3. You have Devil's Cataract, the start of the 9th gorge. You can see the water coming quite clearly through the island there, and then the main falls. And this is where we start getting wet, so we have to make sure our cameras are protected. If you don't have a bag to take with you, most people normally steal the laundry bag from the hotel. But anyway, so we move on now, folks. We're now opposite the main falls, and this is a great place to take some photographs. There's a section of this was used. I don't know if you've ever watched The Lion King with your children or your grandchildren, but this was used in the first part of that movie. So you'll recognize it from that, I hope. And then we'll carry on. Now, folks, there's one thing to remember of the Victoria Falls. There are no barriers. They have a very low brush barrier, and I advise you to keep away from it. And this section here, there are no barriers at all. So please do be careful. We're going to move on now from the main part of the falls. We'll look out across over here where we have, I don't know if many of you have heard of what's called Devil's Pool, where a lot of people come and swim in the Victoria Falls, looking out over the edge. I've got some photos a little bit further on, and you can see some youngsters there who've come from Livingstone Island over here. They swam across the back, and the Devil's Pool is this little area here. It's probably about 12 foot in diameter, and you jump off the rocks into the pool, and you can lean on that ledge there. So quite an amazing experience. I'm not sure how brave too many of you will be to do that, but yeah, we will see it. You can see from this slide how close to the edge they are. You do have a lip of rock. It's probably about 1 foot wide, and the water comes in behind you and goes right over the edge. And then you've got there's the Victoria Falls rainforest, and over that side there is where David Livingstone's statue is. So we're slowly coming eastward. We're not even halfway of the tour of the falls yet, so it is quite long. So folks, we've moved on from this part of the river here. We're now going to start going towards the knife's edge, and then to the Vic Falls Bridge, and we'll see that from the side of it. We can do a walking tour, just depending on your timing, but you've got to remember that you'll probably be paying visas if you do go into Zambia, and it is quite a long walk, but it's quite good to do. So again, sensible walking shoes. We walk across the face of the falls. We'll see Livingstone Island, where David Livingstone stayed for 3 nights, discovering the Victoria Falls. And that's when that famous saying that he had of "scenes so lovely, they must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight." Here you have Horseshoe Falls, and then the Rainbow Falls there. But this section of the falls, folks, this dries up every year. So you come in about October, November, this section will be dry. You'll have no spray, so it gives you a great opportunity to actually see the rock face in front of you. You don't normally get to see that. So that's quite a spectacular thing to see as well. And this part of the falls, the main falls, that flows year round. Carry on. And we now come to the side view of the Victoria Falls Bridge. I don't know if you've researched much of this, but the Victoria Falls Bridge was built between 1903 and 1905. It was funded by a man called Cecil John Rhodes. He was what we call an arch imperialist, and he had this vision of creating a railway line from Cape Town to Cairo. And his railways were his main line of communication, so he had to build his railway line. And I always like people to bear in mind that David Livingstone visited here in November of 1855. 50 years later, they built this bridge in 1905. So you had an idea of how quickly history happened in this part of the world. For people who'd been living in the late Iron Age, all of a sudden they're confronted with things like the steam engine. So it's quite a thought to keep in mind of the history of this area. The bridge was built for a cost of £72,000, and the engineers wanted to build the bridge about 14 kilometers upstream. And there was always this romantic story that Cecil John Rhodes built the bridge here because he wanted the spray from the carriages to dash against the carriages as they went over the Victoria Falls. That was a load of nonsense. He was a businessman, and this was the cheaper option, so they built the bridge here. 198 meters long, and it has something in the region of 1,500 tons of steel that was cold riveted in place, no welding. And one of the things that is always quite a feat in my mind is that there are about 450 people that were employed in the building of this bridge. Only 2 people lost their lives, and that's quite an amazing feat. It's a very important part of the communication between the northern part of Central and Southern Africa and the southern part. You only have 3 places where you can cross the Zambezi River from all the mines up in the northern part of Zambia, the copper mines, and also the big copper, cobalt, and titanium mines in the bottom end of Congo. They all come over the 3 bridges that connect, 1 in Botswana and 2 in Zimbabwe. This is the only rail link, though, that goes over. It's still used today. There's probably 10 or 12 freight trains a day that go over it. So an amazing feat of engineering that they built this. It's still going today. You can do a walking tour of the bridge, quite amazing. And for those of you that are very brave, there's a little hut there is where you can do your bungee jumping from. So once we've finished our tour of the bridge, we'll start making our way back to the main area. So we'll come back from Knife's Edge over here, which is the confluence of the Zambian side of the Zimbabwe side. You'll see the river flowing below you. We'll come and have a look at the bridge. Then we make our way along a pathway all the way back to the back of the rainforest, the main entrance. So for those of you who are not up to the walk, there are 1 or 2 places that you can come back, and we'll meet you at, there's a small cafe there. We can meet you there. You can have a cold drink and then wait for us. But yeah, if you can, if you make the tour, it's well worth it. You will have free time in your tour so that you can come back and visit it on your own if you so wish. We'll come from the Victoria Falls, then go back to our hotels. So folks, I did refer earlier on about some controversy that had happened late last year, November last year, where we had people trying to highlight the effects of climate change and the way that it was reported affected Victoria Falls very, very negatively or very adversely. We got a lot of negative impact out of this. And we basically had some reporters who came out, and what they did was they focused on part of the Victoria Falls, and you can see there's one of the ladies here, I think her name was Alex Crawford, from Sky News, and they highlighted the dry side of the Victoria Falls. They didn't mention or turn around and say what was behind them, that the main falls was actually flowing. So just that slight change in the way they put their show across, which was about climate change, did affect us. And I don't think this is the best way to highlight something like climate change. Climate change is something that does affect us all, and we do see it in our rainfalls. They have changed slightly. But when you get people coming out and having this sort of publicity, the people on the ground living in Victoria Falls, we're affected hugely by this. But please don't worry, when you do come and visit Victoria Falls, it still flows, and it is still flowing. So it is not going to go away. They did have other reports that came out saying that we've got the highest flow that we've had in the last 10 years. That's something that's quite sad, because I think they're only opening the Victoria Falls up, even for locals, probably in a week or 2. So we still can't go and see it ourselves. We can hear it, but we can't go and see it. And this is when I talked about that flow rate of something in the region of 490,000 cubic meters of water a minute going over the falls. That's what's happening there now, and we can't go and see it. But there was some footage done by a guy called Tommy Varley. He took some footage about 2 weeks ago, which gives you some idea of the magnificence of the Victoria Falls that it is now. So folks, if you look at, this is the Zambezi River Authority. They are now looking, these are slightly old, they're from April, and you can see our water level now is going right up, and it's probably going to surpass what we've had a couple of years ago, somewhere in the region of 5,000 cubic meters of water a second going over the Victoria Falls. So we are heading for that. So that's something we're going to have to look forward to. Just to show you this slide here, folks, if you can, if you can bear with me. Those reporters that came out, this is where they were standing, and they took those images of the Victoria Falls. And you can see quite clearly, this photo would have been taken sometime October, November, and you can see the main part of the falls still flowing, and from Livingston Island going across, the water flow has stopped. They do divert the water off here, and there's a small little weir that takes water off for a small power station in the gorge. That also affects the water going over the falls, but this section here traditionally dries up. And that you can see that the gorge is quite exposed. You can see that the ground is suffering now. The end of winter, the rains haven't come yet, so the bush isn't lush and green. So you have David Livingstone's statue over here, the Devil's Cataract, Cataract Island, the main falls, Livingstone's Island over there, that's Horseshoe Falls, Rainbow Falls, and then the Eastern Cataract. But this side does dry up, but don't worry, it will come back later on. I'm just going to show you another photo. This is, again, taken about 10 days ago, and you can see the difference. That whole area on the eastern side there has actually stopped, is now still flowing. And when I talk about the spray going up about 500 meters, you can see this was taken at sunrise. The sunrise is behind the Victoria Falls. And for those of you that are keen photographers, if you can get down to the terrace at the Victoria Falls Hotel about 6:15 in the morning, this is the kind of photograph you can expect to get with the sun rising behind the Victoria Falls. And the sun goes down over there, and that's where we get those magnificent sunsets. And this is, again, another photograph taken from the back of the Victoria Falls on the same day, the sun rising over here, and the lights on the Victoria Falls, and the bush, again, looking quite magnificent. One of the things that we have had with this lockdown is the amount of animals coming to the Victoria Falls. From where I live 1.7 kilometers from the Victoria Falls. I do have open bush in front of me, and we have lots of elephants and kudu and buffalo and everything at night in front of us. So I'm very grateful for the lockdown. It's brought the animals back and keeps the beauty in Victoria Falls. So folks, in conclusion, I know I've sort of gone a bit fast through this, but I hope I've given you some idea how the Victoria Falls was formed, and that it is very, very ancient, and how the water levels affect the Victoria Falls. So please do make a plan, come out and see us. I not be one of the ones guiding you, but we have got a superb range of guides out there who will take you and show you this part of the world, and there's a lot to see. I thank you for your time, and I hope I've given you some insight.
Thanks, Mark. We have a lot of questions. Our first question, and this question you probably get, which side of the river is it best? Which side is it best to see the falls from?
The Zimbabwe side of the Victoria Falls.
Of course.
The only reason being is that we have so much of the falls on the Zimbabwe side. The Zambian side probably only has about 400 meters, and we have about 1,300 meters. So that's the only reason. You can see it from the Zambian side, but you're not going to see it as in depth. And particularly when it's very, very dry, you lose the perspective entirely. So the Zimbabwe side is the better side to see it from.
And you said right now that you can't see the falls, right?
If I stand outside, I can hear it. But if I stand on the roof of my motor car, I can see the spray from the falls.
Do you stand on the roof of your motor car a lot?
Not that often, but I know that if I do, I'll see it.
Okay. So the question is it because of COVID, the pandemic, and is that the reason why visitors can't visit the falls?
Yes.
Okay.
What it is when the government instituted the lockdown, they closed all the national parks. So they went and they've done quite a lot of cleaning up in the park, and then in the Zambezi National Park, which is also on our doorstep on the road to Botswana, they've gone and done quite a lot of anti-poaching units, clearing out snares and wood poachers and that sort of thing. So they've taken the opportunity and they've used it wisely.
Oh, okay. So we have a question about the flow of the river and the falls. Yes. So is it ever too dangerous to visit when there's a high flow?
Not walking around in front of the falls. If you do go and you want to go to something like the Devil's Pool, they only use that at certain times of the year because the water flow is too high and you will be swept over. I mean, you may be surprised to hear that elephants and hippos do get swept over the falls. And sometimes you do see them below the Lookout Cafe. There's an eddy there where they always pop up. And it's just the current is too strong that they do get swept away. I think above the falls, if you have a rise of 1 inch above the falls, when that water goes into the narrowness of the Batoka Gorge, that translates into over a foot rise in the gorge. That gives you some idea of the volume and speed of the water. So walking and visiting the falls is not dangerous. It's just wet. And because of, in some places, algae does grow on the pathways, so you do have to watch your footing. But if you're in the river, I mean, even rafting, they stop rafting at certain times of the year because the water level is too high. But we won't be, I'm not sure how many of us are that adventurous to go whitewater rafting.
Not me. So is the Zambezi dammed?
Yes, it is. In two sections, the Kariba Dam, that from Victoria Falls, the back end of Kariba Dam is about 95 kilometers from us. The Kariba Dam was built in the early 1950s as a hydroelectric plant between as what was then northern and southern Rhodesia. And it was the largest man-made dam in the world at the time. It's 250 kilometers long by 45 kilometers wide. And then a little bit beyond that, going into Mozambique, you have another dam called Cabora Bassa. And that was built by the Portuguese in 1972. And that supplies power to both Mozambique and to South Africa. So yes, it is dammed.
Okay, this question is from Robert. How warm is the water at the Devil's Pool? Those people look comfortable.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you know, if you come there in October, it's probably around 22 degrees centigrade. It's warm. It's very, very warm. It's quite shallow as well. So it's not 22. Yeah, it's warm. It's very warm. You know, I wouldn't go in it now. With middle of winter, so it's much cooler. But yeah, October, November, December, very warm, very pleasant.
And this question relates back to the question about dams, but Lou would like to know, how is water management responsibly shared by the various countries that contribute water to the Victoria Falls?
I think, you know, pre-1964, when most countries were run by colonial governments, it was a lot easier to do things. I think nowadays it's a lot more difficult. There has been talk of another dam that they want to build about 60 kilometers below the Victoria Falls. And when you have a river like the Zambezi River that is shared by 6 countries, whether you're upstream or downstream, everybody has to agree. So if you have someone like Mozambique that is having, let's say, a labor or a trade row with Zambia, when it comes to something like this, they won't agree. Till you know politics. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So you know there is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes between countries. You can't, for instance, say build a dam in Zambia and dam the water there and stop the water coming down to both Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Zambia. That just won't happen because nobody will agree. Because downstream, other people need this water. It is managed by a thing called the Zambezi River Authority, which is run by both Zambia and Zimbabwe. But that's to manage the actual water levels. But when it comes to inter-country agreements, it's quite a tricky one. There's a lot of pushing and pulling goes on. I think the best thing that we've had so far is a thing called the CASA Transfrontier Agreements that have affected this area here, which a lot of it's to do with animal migration, but it's also brought in a lot of visa clarity with us, where you pay one visa coming into this area, you don't have to pay another visa going into Zambia and vice versa. So those sort of political agreements are in place. But when it comes to the river, it's a very different kettle of fish.
No pun intended. We have a question about crocodiles. So Susan would like to know, can you address the dangers of crocodiles in the Zambezi?
Yes. Okay. You know, there are a lot of crocodiles in this river. But when you go to places where there's rapids, moving water, you don't normally find crocodiles. So places like Devil's Pool, there's no crocodiles nearby because there's probably 300 meters of rapids behind it before the river actually goes over the falls. But anywhere where there's still deep water, you keep away from it. You know, people living in Victoria Falls, obviously we go fishing on the banks of the Zambezi River. And every year, 1 or 2 people, unfortunately, do get taken by crocodiles. And it's, you know, livestock, that sort of thing also gets taken by crocodiles further downstream. But, you know, if we're going to go on tours and we're going to be going in boats, they're big, flat-bottom boats. very stable. So there's no chance, unless you fall in accidentally, but there's no chance of crocodiles getting to you.
In one of the earlier slides, there was a sign at the entrance to Victoria Falls, and there
Yes.
was can you repeat the name?
Okay, the name is Mosio Atunya, which is the local name for it, and it means the smoke that thunders. It was given that name by the Tokolea people. They live predominantly on the northern banks of the Zambezi River in Zambia. So they called it Mosio Atunya, which means the smoke that thunders.
And are there other indigenous groups in the region besides the one you just mentioned?
Yeah, no, you have the Tokolea living on the northern banks of the Zambezi River. Obviously, the original inhabitants of this part of the world were the Kalahari Sand Bushmen, and then you had the Bantu migrations coming down about 2,500 years ago, extending all the way into South Africa. So the tribes that are in this area, you have the Tokolea to the north, the Nambuya, which are the people living in the immediate vicinity of the Victoria Falls, and then the people who came later in the late 1820s were a tribe of people called the Matabele, and they were fleeing persecution from the Zulus in South Africa. They migrated north, settled in a place called Bulawayo, and they then became the dominant tribe. Off to the west, you have the Botswana people, the Setswana, and then off to the east, you have the Batonka, and then the Shona people further to the east of Zimbabwe. So yeah, it's the immediate tribes in the area. There are the three major tribes: the Tokolea, the Matabele, and the Nambuya.
Okay. So you mentioned the rainforest. Can
Yes,
you describe what type of animals are in the rainforest and a little bit more about the rainforest? How big is it? Yeah.
Okay, the rainforest is probably only about 350 meters long and about 150 meters back. And it exists purely because there's rain, or there's the spray coming up from Victoria Falls comes down as rain. And that promotes the growth. You have great sunshine here. You have all the nutrients in the river, all the hippo dung and the elephant dung that's in the water. That comes down in the spray. And that gives a good nutrient base. So the trees that you see in the rainforest, things like your waterberry, your jackalberry, your ivory, your leadwood trees, your milkwood trees, all of those grow to twice the height they normally grow on the banks of the river. They're riverine trees. You'll only find them near water, but in the rainforest, they go to twice the height of that. You do get baboons and vervet monkeys coming through, and it's quite good fun because you'll be walking along and they'll be sitting on the paths right next to you, very, very close. So don't worry about them. They're not going to attack you or anything. We do have warthogs and little bushbuck, which I think is about the same size of your deer. They are in the rainforest. But about 15 years ago, the national parks did put a metal palisade fence around the Victoria Falls because we started getting a lot of buffalo and elephant inside the rainforest, and that was becoming a danger to people. So otherwise, the footpaths that you see on the rainforest were put there in 1972. And the national parks took a policy then of no development. So there's no, fancy ironwork or the walkways of what they built in 1972. And you can imagine what health and safety was in those days. That's how they left it. So we are one of those countries where if you see something's dangerous and you do go over the side, tough luck, I'm afraid. So do bear that in mind as well. But yes, the rainforest is quite an amazing place to go to. The ferns that you have there, you have 3 different types of fern. You have 2 types of palm tree growing in there, the reticulaata, you have the alala palm, you have date palms growing in there, the reticulaata, you have wild ginger growing in there, you have flame lilies, our national flower grows in there, it's a creeper, and another one called a fireball lily, which only comes out like a week before, 2 weeks before the rains come in October, and all of a sudden you have these beautiful red, they start sort of yellow in the middle, coming down to crimson, yellow on the outside, going orange, red, and crimson in the middle. And they carpet certain parts of it, and that is quite magnificent. So there's a lot of birds as well. If any of you are keen birders, we have a lot of birds in the rainforest as well.
I'm sure we do have some on watching right now. A few more questions. First, Jane says she went on this trip in 2017, and you were her guide, so it was an unforgettable experience and one that I recommend not to be missed. But we have a few more questions about the political situation. So what's the political situation in Zambia, and compare that to Zimbabwe?
Okay.
In a minute or 2 minutes.
In a minute or 2 minutes? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, basically, Zimbabwe and Zambia, both ex-colonies of England. Zambia became independent in 1964, went to multi-party democracy. Zimbabwe, of course, we had our civil war from 1964 or 1968 through to about 1980 when we had our elections. And we had Robert Mugabe come in. So our political situation has leaned itself towards a one-party state. Basically, I've had Mugabe as my president till he was ousted from power 2 years ago for 37 years.
Wow.
In Africa, you get one vote once. So since Mugabe was deposed and Mnangagwa came in, the political situation has changed. The political parties that were out there are not as prevalent or as powerful as they used to be. We have a very autocratic way of ruling here. It's not so much a democracy, it's a veneer of democracy. So it is, quite a tough place in the sense that you can't be too outspoken about government. It's kind of different for me and living in Victoria Falls. Victoria Falls is very different than the rest of Zimbabwe. They don't let anything get too involved in what goes on here. But yeah, it's quite a tough political situation, of course. We have the normal problems of quite a lot of corruption within government, which has affected our future. We don't have the support from the rest of the world, like the World Bank, because we're not part of the world, really. We don't respect the rule of the law, so that the government is not helped. Zambia, also quite stable. Their economy is backed by copper. They do have a good, strong democracy. They are having problems at the moment with their leadership. He's not proving as popular as he thought he was, and he's coming in with some quite autocratic ways of doing things. But they've got elections coming up in the next 2 years, so let's see where that goes. Economically, they're a lot stronger than Zimbabwe. We have the wealth, we have the minerals, we have the human capital to make this a magnificent country, but corruption, unfortunately, has been our downfall. So we as Zimbabweans are hoping we'll find a Zimbabwean solution to this. We thought we had that with the ousting of Mugabe in 2017, but that didn't happen. But it has made us come together. It's made a lot of barriers come down racially, where we all realize we are Zimbabweans, we're all being affected by this government. So that's a good thing. But then, of course, COVID-19 hasn't helped. With no travel, Victoria Falls has died a death. It's very, very quiet and very, very sad. But we'll see later on in the year how things recover. So we're all here. We're not going anywhere. We're all still waiting for you. But yeah, politically, I think, when you're here and we can show you how things work and a bit more detail than we've got on this platform at the moment. But yeah, keep watching, keep looking. You'll see a lot more stuff, I think, in the news coming up the next couple of months. Let's see what happens.
Okay, Mark. Well, that unfortunately concludes our webinar for today. But thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Take care.